Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a man born in a small Missouri farm town, a man who tried his hand at farming, ran a failed haberdashery, and initially really struggled with debt. Then, almost overnight, this really unassuming individual is thrust onto the world stage, making decisions that would literally define the rest of the 20th century. How does that happen? How did Harry S. Truman, a seemingly ordinary man, become one of the most consequential presidents in U.S. history? Here on the deep dive, we're not just skimming the surface of history, we're truly immersing ourselves in the fascinating life and, well, monumental presidency of this remarkable figure. Our mission today is to unearth the pivotal moments, the surprising personal qualities, and the profound challenges that shaped his time in office and ultimately his enduring, often debated legacy.
And what's truly striking here is the sheer weight of history that landed on Truman's shoulders. His presidency, spanning from 1945 to 1953, wasn't just a period of change. It was the crucible where modern America and global geopolitics were forged. We're talking about the immediate aftermath of World War II, the terrifying dawn of the nuclear age, and the very genesis of the Cold War. You can only begin to fathom the immense pressure he faced and the scale of the challenges, both domestic and international, that landed on his desk. He was navigating a world dramatically reshaped by conflict and an emerging ideological divide.
Exactly. So, our goal for you today, our listener, is to move beyond the textbook summaries. We want to uncover the truly insightful nuggets of knowledge from our sources, understand the major turning points in Truman's life with crucial context, and genuinely appreciate the profound complexities of a man who famously declared, "The buck stops here." We'll look at the surprising facts and the deep-seated motivations that help you understand Truman's unparalleled impact, all without feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. This is going to be quite a journey, revealing how an unexpected leader navigated an unprecedented era.
The formative years, unexpected paths to public service.
Our story begins far from the corridors of power in Lamar, Missouri, where Harry S. Truman entered the world on May 8, 1884, the oldest child of John Anderson Truman and Martha Ellen Young Truman. Now, about that distinctive middle initial S, it's one of those unique biographical details that often piques curiosity. It's not, as many assume, an abbreviation for a single specific name. Instead, it was a way to honor both of his grandfathers, Anderson Ship Truman and Solomon Young. This was a common practice in the American South at the time, a nod to both sides of the family right from the start, embodying his deep family roots.
It's a small detail, but it speaks to a strong sense of family and tradition that anchored him throughout his life. His mother, Martha Ellen, played an incredibly formative role, especially in his early education. She instilled in him a lifelong love for music, reading, history, and math.
Absolutely. Imagine this. A future president, known for his straight-talking, sometimes pugnacious style, was a skilled pianist. He started playing at age 7 and would practice for hours, often getting up at 5 o'clock every morning to do so, a routine he maintained until he was 15. This speaks volumes about his self-discipline and his mother's influence. It's also quite remarkable that he didn't attend a conventional school until he was 8 years old. So his early learning was largely shaped by home and personal exploration rather than traditional schooling.
That unique educational path, marked by extensive self-study rather than formal academia, profoundly shaped his pragmatic, results-oriented leadership. It wasn't necessarily tied to intellectual theories. His approach was rooted more in historical precedent, the lessons he gleaned from his vast reading, and direct, hands-on experience. This intellectual independence would prove both a unique strength and, at times, a limitation in how he engaged with highly academic or abstract policy debates later in his presidency.
And speaking of not having a college degree, he's actually the only president since William McKinley who was elected way back in 1896 without one. He did take night courses toward an LLB, a Bachelor of Laws degree, at the Kansas City Law School from 1923 to 1925, but he dropped out after losing his re-election campaign as county judge. Interestingly, while serving as president in 1947, he applied for a law license but changed his mind before following up. The Missouri Supreme Court, however, did issue him a posthumous honorary license in 1996, which I think is a wonderful acknowledgement of his lifelong dedication to public service and self-education, a continuous pursuit of knowledge.
It certainly is, and his early working career also offers a rich tapestry of experiences that provided a foundational understanding of American life. He held a series of varied, often physically demanding jobs. A brief stint in the mailroom of the Kansas City Star, then as a timekeeper for railroad construction crews, which required him to sleep in workmen's camps, and later as a clerk at the National Bank of Commerce. These seemingly mundane roles were, in fact, Truman's informal education in American grit and the financial precarity faced by ordinary people. This grounding would later make him exceptionally attuned to the domestic economic challenges post-WWII, often clashing with his Ivy League-educated advisors who sometimes lacked that direct practical insight into the lives of working-class Americans.
But not all his early ventures were successful, far from it. After returning to the Grandview farm in 1906, he tried his hand at several business ventures, including a lead and zinc mine and real estate speculation. These ultimately left him mired in significant debt. He actually didn't pay off the last of those debts until 1935, nearly 2 decades later, thanks to the help of banker William T. Kemper, who facilitated a complex deal to relieve him of a significant promissory note. This recurring experience with financial instability and the crushing weight of debt likely shaped his later views on financial prudence, governmental responsibility, and economic policy, giving him a deeply grounded, empathetic understanding of personal and national economic struggles. It certainly hammered home the reality of hard times and sound financial management.
This raises an important question. How do our early environments and the setbacks we face shape us? And what allows individuals to transcend those influences? Truman's upbringing in a largely segregated Missouri, for example, initially reflected some of the common prejudices against African and Asian Americans prevalent at the time, which we even see in his early letters. Yet he later became one of the most staunch civil rights supporters among presidents, taking unprecedented executive action. This journey from a localized, sometimes prejudiced worldview to a champion of national civil rights is a profound testament to an individual's capacity for growth and adaptation, often driven by new experiences and evolving moral convictions. His varied early jobs and business failures also built a remarkable resilience and a deep understanding of common people's struggles, which would directly inform his later policy decisions and his reputation as the man from independence.
That's a truly profound point, and it perfectly sets the stage for his military service in World War I, which truly seems to have been a pivotal, transformative period for him. He initially harbored dreams of attending West Point, but was rejected due to incredibly poor eyesight, 20/50 in his right eye, and an astonishing 2400 in his left. But Truman wasn't one to give up easily, especially when faced with a challenge. He famously and secretly memorized the eye chart to pass his second attempt to enlist in the Missouri National Guard in 1905, serving until 1911. It's a fantastic anecdote that highlights his sheer determination.
It speaks volumes about his tenacious spirit and resourcefulness, even at a young age. This wasn't just about joining the military. It was about overcoming a significant personal obstacle through sheer will and, well, a bit of ingenuity. That persistence would serve him throughout his political career.
Fast forward to 1917 when the U.S. entered World War I. Truman, now 33, re-enlisted in Battery B, successfully recruiting new soldiers and being elected by his fellow men as their first lieutenant. Before deployment to France, he trained at Camp Doniphan, Fort Sill. And here, we see another interesting business venture. But this one, unlike his haberdashery, was a resounding success. He ran the camp canteen with Edward Jacobson, a clothing store clerk he knew from Kansas City. Unlike many canteens, which often struggled financially, theirs turned a remarkable profit, returning each soldier's initial $2 investment and a remarkable $10,000 in dividends within 6 months. This early business success was a stark contrast to his pre-war failures and likely significantly boosted his confidence in his organizational and leadership abilities, proving he could manage complex operations effectively. It was also at Fort Sill that he met Lieutenant Bings M. Pendergast, nephew of the infamous Kansas City political boss Tom Pendergast, a connection that would prove profoundly influential.
Indeed, that meeting with Pendergast's nephew was a key seed planted for his political future. But before we pivot there, let's underscore one more critical aspect of his wartime leadership. He was promoted to captain in mid-1918 and took command of the notoriously undisciplined Battery D 129th Field Artillery. This unit was known for its rowdiness and lack of cohesion, often engaging in brawls and insubordination. He faced immediate resistance in a chaotic environment. Yet he masterfully restored order, not through brute force, but by holding his corporals and sergeants accountable. He promised to back them up unequivocally if they performed capably and consistently, but he also made it clear he would reduce them to private if they failed to maintain discipline. This clear chain of command and consistent enforcement worked wonders.
He certainly had a real lead-by-example approach, tempered with an uncompromising demand for accountability. There's a vivid anecdote from his time with Battery D, which his men later affectionately and perhaps with a touch of dark humor called the Battle of Who Run. During a sudden German night attack in the Vosges Mountains, shells started falling, and his notoriously rough and ready soldiers started to flee in panic. Truman, surprisingly to his men, who hadn't heard him swear much, erupted with profanity from his old railroad days, shocking them with his forceful, expletive-laden orders to stay and fight. They were so taken aback by his language and his raw courage in the face of danger that they immediately obeyed, and he successfully rallied them, turning chaos into order. It's a moment that cemented his authority and proved his ability to lead under fire.
That moment truly illustrates his ability to command respect and make decisive choices under extreme pressure, demonstrating a hidden wellspring of leadership. He also displayed remarkable strategic thinking during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He received orders that limited his targets to those directly facing his 35th Division. However, he spotted an enemy artillery battery deploying across a river, posing a significant threat to a neighboring 28th Division, but outside his immediate area of engagement. Rather than engaging immediately, which would have been the easy, compliant action, he patiently waited until the German soldiers had walked their horses well away from their guns, ensuring they couldn't quickly relocate. Only then did he order his men to open fire, destroying the battery and saving countless lives in the neighboring division. He faced a threat of court-martial for disregarding orders, but ultimately he was never punished. His actions were vindicated by their effectiveness and the lives saved.
What's truly remarkable is that his unit lost no men under his command in France. And as a testament to his leadership, his men presented him with a loving cup as a token of their thanks, a rare and cherished honor. This period was truly transformative. Truman gained invaluable leadership experience, not just in military tactics, but in managing diverse groups, including Catholics and Jews, which was not common at the time. He learned how to inspire loyalty and command respect. This record of success directly underpinned his post-war political aspirations, equipping him with critical interpersonal skills essential for his political future, particularly in a diverse urban political landscape like Kansas City.
It's clear that the disciplined, decisive leader forged in the trenches of World War I was a far cry from the jet-ridden Haberdasher. He returned home a changed man with a newfound confidence and a proven ability to lead, which he would soon apply to a very different kind of battlefield politics.
The path to the White House from county judge to vice president.
So Captain Truman returned home from the war, a decorated and confident leader, but life wasn't immediately easy on the domestic front. He married his sweetheart, Elizabeth Bess Wallace, on June 28, 1919. They had met before the war, and he'd even proposed in 1911, only to be turned down initially because, as she put it, he didn't have much money. But she eventually came around, and they went on to have one child, their beloved daughter, Mary Margaret Truman.
And, in a familiar pattern that seemed to haunt his pre-political career, he once again tried his hand at business.
That's right. Shortly after his wedding, he and Eddie Jacobson, his successful canteen partner from the war, opened a haberdashery in downtown Kansas City. They had initial success, riding the post-war boom. However, the store went bankrupt during the sharp recession of 1921, leaving him once again deeply in debt for years. He actually didn't pay off the last of those debts until 1935. It seemed financial hardship was a recurring theme in his early life, a constant reminder of economic volatility.
That experience profoundly reinforced his understanding of economic cycles and personal financial struggles. It's a valuable, though hard-won lesson for any public servant, imbuing him with a deep empathy for citizens facing similar challenges.
His entry into politics in 1922 was a direct result of the powerful Kansas City Democratic machine, led by the infamous Tom Pendergast. Truman became an administrative county court judge for Jackson County's Eastern District. This wasn't a judicial position in the legal sense. It was more akin to a county commissioner, overseeing public works and budgets. He served a term but then lost his re-election campaign in 1924, caught in a Republican wave led by President Calvin Coolidge's landslide victory.
That loss was a significant turning point for him personally. It convinced him that public service offered a more stable and fulfilling career path than his previous, often ill-fated business ventures, particularly for a family man approaching middle age. He then successfully ran for presiding judge, a more senior administrative role, in 1926, again with Pendergast's support, serving until 1935.
As presiding judge, he really left his mark on Jackson County. He coordinated the ambitious 10-year plan, a massive public works initiative that transformed the county's infrastructure. This included an extensive series of new, modern roads, often criticized as Truman's concrete ribbons, and a brand-new, architecturally significant county court building. He oversaw the dedication of 12 Madonna of the Trail monuments nationally, honoring pioneer women, demonstrating his appreciation for history and civic pride. Through these projects, he was building a solid reputation as a capable, efficient administrator, someone who could get things done.
This period often raises critical questions about political machines and their influence on public officials. Truman acknowledged that he referred patronage decisions, things like who got minor government jobs or contracts, to Pendergast, understanding the political realities of the time and the quid pro quo nature of machine politics. However, he always maintained that he voted with his own conscience on policy matters and major public expenditures. He famously claimed he saved a lot by offering a little to the machine, suggesting a pragmatic approach to a complex political reality. It illustrates the compromises sometimes made in order to achieve broader public good through public office while trying to maintain personal integrity within a flawed system. He walked a fine line, leveraging the machine's power for civic improvements without, he argued, succumbing entirely to its corruption.
From county judge, he set his sights on the U.S. Senate. In 1934, Pendergast reluctantly backed Truman for the U.S. Senate from Missouri. The story, now legendary, goes that Truman was Pendergast's fifth choice after his first four preferred candidates declined to run, a testament to Truman's status as a dark horse candidate. But Truman won the Democratic primary and the general election with crucial support from Jackson County, the Pendergast stronghold, and also from statewide contacts he painstakingly cultivated. These included his extensive network through the Freemasons, where he was later elected Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Missouri, and his strong connections with military reservists and the American Legion. He was, in fact, the founder of the Reserve Officers Association and organized Missouri's first American Legion post. So while Pendergast provided the initial push, Truman had built a formidable independent base.
He had certainly built a strong, diverse network that extended well beyond Pendergast's direct influence, which was crucial to his broader political viability. Despite these connections, he initially assumed office with a somewhat challenging reputation as the senator from Pendergast. This label immediately cast a shadow over his legitimacy. He spoke out vigorously against corporate greed and the dangers of Wall Street speculators, themes that resonated with his own personal experiences with financial instability. However, he was largely ignored by President Roosevelt during his first term in the Senate, struggling to even get his calls returned from the White House, a frustrating experience for any junior senator.
This struggle for recognition continued into his re-election campaign in 1940. Pendergast's imprisonment for income tax evasion the previous year politically weakened Truman, who nonetheless remained fiercely loyal to his old mentor, claiming Republican judges, not the Roosevelt administration, were responsible for Pendergast's downfall. Despite this political liability, he still won re-election, in part because his opponents split the anti-Pendergast vote. It's also during this time, in June 1941, just 2 days after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, that he made a rather complex statement about the German-Soviet conflict. Quote, "If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible." Quote, "Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances." This quote, often taken out of context by omitting its crucial last part, later became a staple in Soviet and Russian propaganda as evidence of an American conspiracy to destroy the Soviet Union, highlighting how wartime rhetoric can be weaponized with long-lasting implications.
It's a stark reminder of how political statements, especially in times of global conflict, can be manipulated for geopolitical narratives, and how the nuances of a full quote can be lost to serve a specific agenda. The complexities of his initial neutrality stance demonstrate the difficult tightrope American leaders walked before officially entering the war.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and where Truman's national political career truly took off, transforming his image completely. In late 1940, with the nation gearing up for war, Truman, a keen observer, began to notice alarming signs of waste, inefficiency, and outright profiteering in gigantic government wartime contracts. He initiated investigations, which led to the creation of a new special committee, which came to be known as the Truman Committee. Its mandate was to expose and fight waste and corruption in the burgeoning war production efforts.
The White House actually supported the formation of the committee, preferring a formal internal congressional investigation rather than potentially more hostile and politically damaging probes by the House of Representatives. Truman managed the committee with extraordinary skill, demonstrating his administrative prowess. He generated heavy media publicity, turning dry procurement audits into national headlines, and earning him a growing national reputation as a tenacious watchdog. It was a masterclass in effective oversight and accountability, precisely what the American public craved amidst wartime spending.
The committee's activities were wide-ranging and impactful, from criticizing dollar-a-year men, prominent executives who volunteered their services to the government for a symbolic salary during wartime, but often faced accusations of leveraging their positions for corporate advantage, to investigating shoddily built housing projects for war workers and expose inflated contracts for everything from ships to airplanes. Notably, in March 1944, Truman, sensing more waste, attempted to probe the highly secretive Manhattan Project. He was, however, persuaded by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson to discontinue the investigation, unknowingly deferring to the nascent, top-secret atomic bomb program. This committee reportedly saved as much as $15 billion, which is equivalent to about $260 billion in 2024 money. His meticulous work and high-profile findings put Truman on the cover of Time magazine, and, according to Senate historical minutes, Truman erased his earlier public image as an errand runner for Kansas City politicos and became a national figure of integrity and efficiency.
No senator ever gained greater political benefits from chairing a special investigating committee than did Missouri's Harry S. Truman. It was a pivotal turning point that transformed his public image from a local political machine man to a national figure of integrity and efficiency, positioning him as a leader capable of tackling vast, complex national challenges. This was absolutely critical for his next unexpected and utterly profound step onto the national stage.
And that next step, of course, was the vice presidency in 1945, a very short and, as it turns out, profoundly uninformed stint. As President Roosevelt prepared for an unprecedented fourth term, his advisors knew he might not survive. They desperately wanted to replace Vice President Henry Wallace, who was deemed too left-leaning and too friendly to labor unions for the party establishment. Party leaders strongly preferred Truman, despite his repeated reluctance.
It's widely known that Roosevelt would have accepted either Truman or Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, but Truman was the overwhelming choice of party leaders, including powerful figures like Frank C. Walker and Robert E. Hannigan, who later proved crucial in his political trajectory. Truman himself didn't actively campaign for the VP spot, but his newfound national recognition from the Truman Committee certainly made him an attractive, non-controversial option.
The Roosevelt-Truman ticket won a decisive victory in 1944, and Truman was sworn in as vice president on January 20, 1945. His brief vice presidency was remarkably uneventful, lasting only 82 days. He mostly presided over the Senate and attended parties and receptions, almost entirely excluded from major policy discussions. Crucially, Roosevelt rarely contacted him on significant decisions, and they met alone only twice during their time in office. This meant Truman was profoundly and deliberately uninformed about critical initiatives, including the top-secret Manhattan Project, which was on the cusp of testing the world's first atomic bomb. He literally had no idea it even existed.
This complete lack of briefing as vice president is a critical detail that cannot be overstated. Imagine the shock and the terrifying burden of inheriting the most terrible weapon in the history of the world, having absolutely no prior knowledge of its existence, no context for its development, and then being thrust into the presidency at one of the most tumultuous moments in human history. It set the stage for one of the most uniquely challenging and decision-laden presidencies in American history. Adding to the complexities, Truman created some controversy by attending the funeral of his disgraced political patron, Tom Pendergast, shrugging off criticism with a simple yet defiant, "He was always my friend, and I have always been his." It showed a fierce personal loyalty that, while politically risky, revealed a deep-seated aspect of his character.
The weight of the world, Truman's presidency, and pivotal decisions.
So, on April 12, 1945, after only 82 days as vice president, Harry Truman was presiding over the Senate when he received an urgent message to go immediately to the White House. There, Eleanor Roosevelt delivered the devastating news that her husband, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, had died suddenly. Truman's immediate reaction perfectly captures the crushing weight of that moment, a feeling of unpreparedness mixed with immense responsibility. I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. He was sworn in that evening, stepping into the highest office at a time of unprecedented global upheaval, a war still raging in the Pacific and the secrets of the atomic age about to be revealed.
And he truly was thrown into the deep end, inheriting a White House badly understaffed for the immediate post-war challenges. Although he initially asked all of Roosevelt's cabinet members to stay, he soon replaced almost all of them with his own confidants, eager to build a team loyal to his vision. He struggled initially with press relations, often becoming testy and easily annoyed by reporters, a stark contrast to FDR's polished, jovial familiarity. Yet he was a tireless hard worker, often to the point of exhaustion, mastering intricate details like the federal budget and surrounding himself with top advisors on major issues, even if some of his closest friends were later criticized for their competence in high positions. His learning curve was steep and immediate.
The most immediate and profound challenge he faced, with barely 2 weeks in office, was the war in the Pacific. On April 25, 1945, Secretary of War Henry Stimson finally revealed the details of the Manhattan Project to Truman, telling him, with a chilling understatement, "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world." This was the moment the enormous secret, kept even from the vice president, was laid bare, and the burden of its existence fell squarely on his shoulders.
The weight of that revelation must have been unimaginable. Just a few months later, he journeyed to Berlin for the Potsdam Conference, meeting with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill. During the conference, he cryptically hinted to Stalin about America's new weapon of unusual destructive force, unaware that Stalin already knew about the atomic bomb project through his extensive network of espionage. This moment underscored the nascent distrust and the burgeoning intelligence war that would define the post-war era.
In early August, with Japan still refusing the unconditional surrender terms outlined in the Potsdam Declaration, despite the horrific firebombing campaigns that had already devastated their cities, Truman faced an unimaginable decision. He authorized the atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. These two bombings resulted in an estimated 105,000 immediate deaths, with tens of thousands more succumbing to radiation sickness in the weeks and months that followed. His stated rationale, which he steadfastly defended throughout his life, was to save lives on both sides. Military planners had presented truly grim projections for a mainland invasion of Japan, forecasting anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million Allied casualties and potentially millions of Japanese fatalities. He later called it the hardest decision I ever had to make, firmly believing it expedited the end of a brutal war and prevented even greater bloodshed.
This decision remains one of the most intensely debated and morally complex in history, highlighting the agonizing choices leaders must sometimes make under extreme duress. It's essential for us to understand the context of the time, the protracted, brutal nature of the Pacific War, the Japanese government's steadfast refusal to surrender even after repeated warnings, and the perceived catastrophic costs of a conventional mainland invasion. Simultaneously, we must acknowledge the devastating, unprecedented consequences of nuclear weapons and the powerful criticisms that emerged later. Some historians and critics argue that the bombings were unnecessary, suggesting that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and that conventional attacks or a demonstrative bombing of an uninhabited area could have achieved the same outcome without such horrific loss of civilian life. Others posit that the bombings constituted a war crime. This is a conversation that continues to evolve as historical understanding deepens, forcing us to confront the profound ethical dilemmas of total war and the long shadow cast by the nuclear age.
Domestically, the immediate post-war years, particularly from 1946 to 1947, were fraught with immense challenges. The nation faced an uneasy and chaotic transition from a wartime economy, which had been operating at full capacity, to a peacetime one. There were widespread fears of a renewed depression, reminiscent of the 1930s, and soaring inflation as wartime price controls were lifted. This period saw immense labor unrest. Unions, significantly strengthened by the New Deal era, launched large-scale strikes across major industries like steel, coal, and railroads, demanding better wages and conditions after years of wartime sacrifices. In May 1946, a national rail strike, the first since 1894, paralyzed the entire system. Truman responded forcefully, seizing the railroads and even proposing drafting striking workers into the army, a truly radical measure, though the strike was settled before Congress acted fully on his proposal. His response was widely seen as both heavy-handed and ultimately ineffective in resolving the underlying issues, further eroding public trust.
These domestic struggles deeply impacted his public image and political standing. His approval rating plummeted dramatically, from a high of 82% in January 1946 to a mere 32% by June, a stunning drop in just 6 months. This widespread dissatisfaction directly led to Republican control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1930, creating a formidable legislative roadblock. That Republican-controlled Congress then passed the Taft-Hartley Act over Truman's veto. This landmark legislation significantly curtailed union power by, for instance, restricting secondary boycotts, outlawing closed shops, and requiring union leaders to sign non-communist affidavits. It was a direct challenge to the post-New Deal labor movement and a major political defeat for Truman.
Yet, amidst these challenges and political setbacks, Truman began to articulate his expansive vision for the nation, which he later branded the Fair Deal. Ahead of the 1948 election, he proposed ambitious liberal policies, directly building on Roosevelt's New Deal. These included universal national health insurance, comprehensive civil rights legislation, federal aid to education, and expanded public housing. However, because of the conservative backlash and the newly Republican-controlled Congress, most of these proposals were staunchly rejected. Only the Housing Act of 1949, which provided federal funding for urban renewal and slum clearance, ultimately passed, making limited progress on his ambitious domestic agenda.
This demonstrates the formidable conservative coalition that emerged post-war, making domestic legislative progress extremely difficult for Truman, despite his progressive aims. It showed his determination to push forward, even when facing significant congressional opposition, foreshadowing his later executive actions on civil rights.
Moving to foreign policy, this is where Truman essentially laid the foundational architecture for America's post-war international role, establishing the mechanisms and doctrines that would define the Cold War for decades. As a Wilsonian internationalist, he strongly supported the newly formed United Nations, believing in collective security and international cooperation. But unlike Roosevelt, who often tried to work with Stalin, Truman quickly grew to deeply distrust the Soviet leader and his expansionist aims, taking a hard line against Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe and beyond. This formalization of the policy of containment, first articulated by State Department official George Kennan, became known as the Truman Doctrine.
This is a truly pivotal shift in U.S. foreign policy, moving from isolationism to global engagement. The Truman Doctrine committed the U.S. to supporting free peoples who were resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures, essentially drawing a line in the sand against Soviet expansion. To bolster this, and recognizing that economic despair could be fertile ground for communism, Truman approved the Marshall Plan in 1948. This ambitious program provided an extraordinary $13 billion in aid to rebuild war-torn Western European economies. The thinking was clear. Economically vibrant democracies would be resilient to communist influence, a powerful strategic move cloaked in humanitarian aid.
He also spearheaded significant structural changes to the U.S. national security apparatus, fundamentally reshaping how America would conduct foreign policy and intelligence. The National Security Act of 1947 reorganized military forces, merging departments, creating the independent U.S. Air Force, the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, initially intended for intelligence gathering, not covert operations, and the National Security Council, NSC, to advise the president on security matters. Later, in 1952, he authorized the official, though confidential, creation of the National Security Agency, NSA, the U.S. Signals Intelligence Agency responsible for global monitoring and data collection, significantly expanding America's intelligence capabilities.
These institutions and doctrines fundamentally reshaped America's role in global affairs, creating the comprehensive framework for its Cold War strategy and influence for decades to come. However, Truman also faced significant criticism, particularly from conservatives, for losing China in 1949 when Mao Zedong's communists won the Chinese Civil War, driving the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan. Critics argued his administration hadn't done enough to support the nationalists, fueling domestic anti-communist paranoia that would soon erupt into McCarthyism.
But not all his foreign policy was met with criticism. In fact, some of it earned him significant accolades. The Berlin airlift from 1948 to 1949 was a monumental success. When the Soviet Union blockaded all land and water access to West Berlin, attempting to starve the city into submission, Truman approved an unprecedented operation. A massive, sustained effort to airlift food, coal, and other vital supplies into the isolated city. This unprecedented logistical triumph ran for 15 months, with planes landing every few minutes around the clock, delivering over 2 million tons of supplies. It was a huge diplomatic and logistical triumph, signaling America's unwavering commitment to West Berlin, and undoubtedly boosted his 1948 election campaign, showcasing his resolve against Soviet aggression without firing a single shot.
His decision to recognize the State of Israel in 1948 is another critical and deeply complex foreign policy moment. Despite strong objections from the State Department, the Pentagon, and even his highly respected Secretary of State, George Marshall, who feared offending Arab nations, losing crucial Saudi oil supplies, and destabilizing the entire Middle East, Truman recognized the State of Israel only 11 minutes after it declared itself a nation. This momentous decision was influenced by several factors. His former business partner, Eddie Jacobson, a Jewish World War I veteran, passionately lobbied him. Truman's own deep conviction that Jews needed a homeland after the Holocaust, and, pragmatically, the political pressure from Jewish voters in an election year. He famously told his diplomats, in essence, that he had few Arabs among his constituents, indicating a blend of personal conviction and astute political calculation.
Beyond the global stage, Truman made civil rights a moral priority at home, despite the deep-seated prejudices prevalent in the country and within his own party. In 1946, he created the President's Committee on Civil Rights to investigate and address racial discrimination across the nation. This committee then produced the groundbreaking To Secure These Rights report in 1947, a detailed 10-point agenda for comprehensive civil rights reforms, including federal anti-lynching laws, an end to poll taxes, and desegregation of the military.
This was a truly bold and courageous move, especially given the deep divisions within his own Democratic Party and the Solid South's staunch opposition to any form of racial integration. Truman often cited his profound anger at the abuse African-American veterans faced returning from World War II, having fought for freedom abroad only to be denied it at home, as a major factor in his moral awakening on the issue.
In 1947, Truman became the first president to address the NAACP at the Lincoln Memorial, a powerful speech broadcast nationally. He called unequivocally for an end to discrimination, declaring, "Our immediate task is to remove the last remnants of the barriers which stand between millions of our citizens and their birthright. There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry or religion or race or color." When Congress, facing intense Southern opposition, refused to pass his civil rights legislation, he acted decisively through executive orders. In 1948, Executive Order 9981 officially desegregated the U.S. Armed Forces, a monumental step, and Executive Order 9980 prohibited discrimination in federal agencies. A third order in 1951 ensured defense contractors did not discriminate. This was a direct and forceful challenge to the racial status quo, deeply influencing the course of American civil rights and setting the stage for future advancements.
These actions were profoundly significant, not just symbolically, but practically. Truman's determination to use executive power when legislative avenues were blocked marked a crucial turning point for civil rights in America. It solidified his legacy as a president willing to confront deeply ingrained societal prejudices, even at considerable political cost and against fierce opposition from within his own party. He truly moved the needle on civil rights, using the presidential authority to effect change where Congress hesitated.
The comeback kid in the Cold War intensifies, 1948-1953.
All right, let's talk about the 1948 election, because this is truly one of the most astonishing stories in American political history, a textbook case of defying all expectations. Truman's political standing was, to put it mildly, dire. His public approval rating stood at a dismal 36% in the spring of 1948, and almost everyone, including many in his own party, considered him utterly incapable of winning re-election. His Democratic Party was severely fractured, split by two significant third-party challenges. The Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond, a segregationist who led a full-scale revolt of Southern states' rights proponents, and by the progressive Henry Wallace, who pulled votes from the left wing of the party advocating for a more conciliatory approach to the Soviet Union. The political establishment had written him off entirely.
Indeed, the political landscape looked utterly unwinnable for Truman. He was facing a three-way split in his own party, battling both the extreme left and the extreme right, while the mainstream Republican candidate, Thomas E. Dewey, seemed poised for an easy victory. All major polling organizations had effectively written Truman off, stopping their polling well before Election Day, convinced of Dewey's inevitable landslide. The prevailing wisdom was that Republican Thomas E. Dewey was the sure victor, almost a coronation.
Despite this overwhelming pessimism, Truman, ever the fighter, approved a stronger civil rights plank at the Democratic Convention, further alienating the Southern Democrats and leading to the walkout of the Dixiecrats, but signaling his unwavering and principled commitment to the cause. This was a courageous political gamble. He then launched an incredibly aggressive and personal campaign, famously attacking the Republican-controlled 80th Congress, which he derisively called the Do-Nothing Congress. He accused them of obstructing progress and catering to special interests.
He seized on a clear and potent narrative, framing the election not as a referendum on his own popularity, but as a choice between a progressive vision for all Americans and a stagnant, obstructionist opposition that cared little for the common man. This message, delivered with conviction, began to resonate deeply with his core base and, surprisingly, with many undecided voters who felt ignored by the establishment.
And here's where it gets really interesting, a masterclass in grassroots, campaigning against all odds. Truman embarked on a grueling 21,928-mile whistle-stop train tour across the United States. He gave combative, passionate, and deeply personal speeches from the rear platform of his presidential railcar, the Ferdinand Magellan, directly engaging with huge, enthusiastic crowds that gathered at every stop, often numbering in the thousands. His direct, feisty style, his common man appeal, and his willingness to fight for the little guy captured the popular imagination in a way that the static polls completely missed. At one point, 6 stops in Michigan alone drew 500,000 people, and 1 million turned out for a ticker tape parade in New York City. He was connecting with people on a visceral level, reminding them that he was one of them.
The sheer energy and personal connection he forged with voters on this tour were transformative. Since the pollsters had stopped collecting data weeks before the election, they simply failed to capture this late, monumental surge in support for Truman. It's a classic, enduring example of how conventional wisdom and early data can be profoundly misleading in a dynamic political race, and how direct engagement with the electorate can defy all predictions.
The outcome was, of course, a stunning upset that shocked the nation and the world. Truman won with 303 electoral votes, handily defeating Dewey. The iconic image from that night, forever etched in political history, is, of course, a beaming Truman holding aloft the erroneous front page of the Chicago Tribune with a giant, prematurely printed headline, "Dewey defeats Truman."
Oh.
It's the ultimate underdog wins story, a testament to relentless campaigning, unwavering conviction, and direct communication with the electorate. It taught politicians a lasting lesson about the unpredictability of elections and the power of the ground game.
It remains a powerful illustration of political resilience and the unpredictable nature of elections, and it solidified Truman's image as a determined fighter. Once in his full elected term, Truman faced another monumental decision regarding the accelerating nuclear arms race. After the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in August 1949, far sooner than U.S. intelligence had predicted, there was intense debate within the U.S. government, military, and scientific communities about developing the far more powerful hydrogen bomb. Many scientists, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, argued against it on moral grounds, while others, like Edward Teller, championed its necessity for national security.
On January 31, 1950, Truman made the fateful decision to move forward, authorizing the development of the hydrogen bomb. He believed that if the Soviets could make an H-bomb, the United States must do so as well to stay ahead in the escalating nuclear arms race and maintain a credible deterrent. The first U.S. H-bomb, IV Mike, a device so massive it couldn't be deployed as a weapon, was successfully tested in October 1952, unleashing a force equivalent to 10.4 megatons of TNT, dwarfing the Hiroshima bomb. The stakes were now exponentially higher, ushering in an era of unprecedented global existential threat.
And then, almost immediately, the Cold War intensified into a hot war. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, invaded South Korea. Truman swiftly urged United Nations intervention, interpreting the attack as a direct Soviet-backed challenge to the free world. He authorized U.S. troops to operate under the UN flag, led by the legendary General Douglas MacArthur. Crucially, he did not seek formal congressional authorization for this police action, believing most legislators supported his position, but this decision would later haunt him, with the stalemated conflict being widely dubbed Mr. Truman's War and facing intense political opposition.
Initially, UN forces, under MacArthur's daring command, pushed the North Koreans back, even pursuing a rollback policy to reunite the entire Korean peninsula. But this aggressive strategy escalated the conflict dramatically. China, feeling directly threatened by the advance of UN forces toward its border along the Yalu River, issued strong warnings. Despite these, MacArthur pushed on, and China intervened with a massive, large-scale invasion in November 1950, catching UN forces by surprise and forcing them into a brutal retreat. This led to a frustrating, bloody stalemate around the 38th parallel, and a very public, highly controversial clash between Truman and MacArthur. Truman firmly rejected MacArthur's repeated request to attack Chinese supply bases north of the Yalu River, fearing it would lead to a wider, potentially nuclear war with China and the Soviet Union. MacArthur, however, publicly challenged the president's authority and openly promoted his plan to Republican House leaders, effectively undermining the commander-in-chief.
Truman, absolutely determined to uphold the inviolable principle of civilian control over the military, fired MacArthur for insubordination on April 11, 1951. This was among the least politically popular decisions in presidential history, causing Truman's approval ratings to plummet to an abysmal 22%, the lowest of any president until that point, and even leading to widespread calls for his impeachment. Yet, Truman stood firm, demonstrating profound conviction in his role as commander-in-chief. He famously stated, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals." This crisis truly tested the principle of civilian control over the military, a cornerstone of American democracy, and Truman, despite the immense political cost, refused to compromise on it. The war remained a frustrating stalemate for 2 more years, with over 36,000 Americans killed until an armistice was signed in 1953, effectively preserving South Korea's independence.
In direct response to the intensifying Cold War and the Korean conflict, Truman approved NSC 68, a secret foreign policy statement that called for a massive military buildup, tripling the defense budget and globalizing the containment policy. This essentially expanded containment's geographical scope beyond Europe to confront Soviet influence and communism in Asia, Latin America, and other emerging hotspots around the world. He was also a strong supporter of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which was established in 1949 as a formal peacetime military alliance designed for collective defense. Truman appointed General Dwight D. Eisenhower as its first supreme commander, signaling a clear message that the world's democracies were united against Soviet expansion and military aggression.
This was a critical step in building the robust security architecture that would define the Cold War for the next 4 decades, fundamentally altering global alliances. Despite these significant foreign policy achievements, his administration faced ongoing challenges. Truman was initially a strong opponent of Francisco Franco, the right-wing dictator of Spain, withdrawing the American ambassador and keeping Spain out of the United Nations. However, as the Cold War escalated and with strong domestic pressure, particularly from the Catholic Church, he eventually relented, normalizing relations and making loans available to Spain. This demonstrates the complex interplay of ideology, pragmatism, and domestic political pressure in shaping foreign policy, often forcing leaders to make difficult compromises.
Meanwhile, fears of Soviet espionage and communist infiltration at home led to the era of MacArthyism, a period of intense anti-communist paranoia. In 1948, former Soviet spy Whittaker Chambers testified before HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, about an underground communist network. While not implicating Truman directly, the subsequent conviction of former State Department official Alger Hiss for perjury, coupled with the Soviet Union's atomic bomb success in 1949 and the fall of nationalist China, fueled widespread public paranoia and suspicion.
Truman tried to contain these fears by initiating a loyalty program with Executive Order 900-835 in 1947, which mandated loyalty investigations for all federal employees. However, calling the Hiss trial a red herring deepened his trouble with the public and anti-communist critics. Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy then capitalized on this rising anxiety, making unsubstantiated accusations that the State Department and other government agencies were riddled with communists, riding the controversy to political fame and initiating the infamous Second Red Scare. Truman privately called his loyalty program terrible, recognizing its overreach, and publicly called McCarthy the greatest asset the Kremlin has, deeply disapproving of his divisive tactics. It was a difficult balancing act between genuine national security concerns and protecting civil liberties, a balance that McCarthy ruthlessly exploited.
In 1950, Truman stood firm on his principles and vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Act, a controversial piece of legislation designed to combat internal subversion. He called it the greatest danger to freedom of speech, press, and assembly since the Alien and Sedition Laws of 1798, and a long step toward totalitarianism, warning of its potential to undermine fundamental American liberties. However, Congress, swept up in the anti-communist fervor, immediately overrode his veto, a major legislative defeat for the president and a victory for the burgeoning McCarthyite movement.
A powerful statement against what he perceived as an unconstitutional overreach, even if ultimately unsuccessful in stopping the legislation. These incidents vividly demonstrate the immense pressures on a president, both domestically and internationally, and how personal convictions can clash dramatically with political realities and public perception during times of intense fear. The controversies, while not implicating Truman directly in corruption, certainly damaged his administration's public image and fueled the anti-Democrat sentiment brewing as his second term drew to a close.
Adding to the immense pressures of the presidency, the White House itself was undergoing major renovations due to severe structural deterioration, forcing Truman and his family to relocate across the street to Blair House, the presidential guest residence, from 1949 to 1952. It was there, on November 1, 1950, that Puerto Rican nationalists seeking independence attempted to assassinate him in a daring daylight raid. A White House policeman, Private Leslie Koffel, was tragically killed, and one of the assailants, Griselio Torresola, was also killed. Truman, who was upstairs in Blair House, remained unharmed, but the proximity of the attack underscored the constant threats and immense personal risks inherent in the presidency. He later commuted the death sentence of the surviving nationalist, Oscar Collazo, to life imprisonment, a decision that reflected a degree of leniency despite the grave personal danger.
A truly harrowing event that further underscores the constant threats and immense personal risks inherent in the presidency and how Truman faced them with remarkable composure.
In 1952, Truman faced another significant domestic defeat. In response to a labor management impasse during the Korean War, which threatened to halt the supply of critical munitions, he boldly seized the nation's steel mills, which he was essential for national security. However, the Supreme Court, in Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company Sawyer, found his actions unconstitutional, ruling that he had overstepped his executive authority. This was a major defeat for presidential power and a significant check on his authority, coming at a time when he was already politically weakened. His administration also faced several embarrassing corruption investigations, notably by the Senate. These probes revealed issues among officials, including cases of gifts for favors and IRS employees accepting bribes. Truman fired his Attorney General, J. Howard DeGraff, for being, in his view, too zealous with investigations, perhaps fearing a politically motivated witch hunt that could damage innocent parties, or perhaps simply believing his AG was ineffective in stemming the tide of corruption. These incidents, while not directly implicating Truman in any wrongdoing, certainly damaged his administration's public image and contributed to the prevailing mood of Korea, communism, and corruption that Eisenhower would later campaign on.
These incidents show the immense pressures on a president, both domestically and internationally, and how personal convictions can clash with political realities and public perception, often with damaging consequences. The controversies, while not directly implicating Truman in corruption, certainly damaged his administration's image and contributed to the public's desire for a change in leadership as his second term drew to a close.
And on a more personal and very human note, in 1950, a scathing, profanity-laced letter he wrote to a music critic who had panned his daughter Margaret's concert became famously public. He fiercely defended his daughter's honor against the critic, Paul Hume, showing a truly fierce protective streak for his family, a glimpse into the private man behind the public office. With low approval ratings and controversies mounting, Truman made a significant personal decision regarding his political future. Though he was exempt from the 22nd Amendment's term limits, having served before its ratification, he chose not to run for re-election in 1952. This decision was largely due to his abysmal polling numbers, which hit an all-time low of 22% at that point, and advice from his advisors about his age and perceived failing abilities amidst the Korean War stalemate.
He persuaded Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson to run, but Dwight D. Eisenhower, the revered World War II general, won decisively on a powerful campaign against Korea, communism, and corruption, effectively ending 20 years of Democratic presidents. Truman was reportedly annoyed that Eisenhower didn't denounce Senator Joseph McCarthy during the campaign, hinting at a continued tension between their worldviews and Eisenhower's perceived reluctance to directly confront the growing anti-communist hysteria.
Post-presidency and enduring legacy.
After leaving office, Harry Truman returned to his beloved Independence, Missouri, and what's truly fascinating is that his financial situation in post-presidency has long been shrouded in myth and misconception. For decades, it was widely believed that he was near penury, struggling financially. This narrative was perpetuated by some biographers and even by Truman himself, who, in a 1958 TV interview, claimed he'd be on relief right now without inherited property. This idea of the humble, struggling ex-president became a powerful, almost romanticized part of his public image.
It's a classic example of public perception being shaped by an appealing, sympathetic narrative, even when the underlying facts are more complex. While he certainly experienced early debt from his haberdashery and had a modest income as a senator, his finances were significantly transformed by his time in the highest office.
That's right. His presidential salary, which rose from $75,000 to $100,000 during his tenure, along with a tax-free $50,000 expense allowance that he initially received, allowed him to amass significant savings, far more than any president before him. And then there was the considerable income from his writing. He received $670,000 for his commercially and critically successful 2-volume memoirs, Memoirs by Harry S. Truman, an amount equivalent to over $7.8 million in 2024 dollars. This was a substantial sum, ensuring his financial security for life.
The revelation of his financial records in 2009, including tax returns, actually showed that his net worth in 1959 was over $1 million, which is equivalent to over $11.2 million in 2024. This wealth included a share of the Los Angeles Rams football team, an intriguing detail for a former president. This reassessment definitively challenges that long-held narrative about Truman's post-presidential struggles, showing that he was financially secure, though he and Bess always maintained a remarkably modest lifestyle and independence. It's also significant that his behind-the-scenes lobbying for support for former presidents ultimately led to the Former Presidents Act of 1958, establishing a $25,000 yearly pension for them, along with office space and staff support. Herbert Hoover, the only other living former president at the time, reportedly also took the pension, not out of need, but specifically to avoid embarrassing Truman by making him the sole recipient.
Beyond his personal finances, Truman dedicated himself to establishing his presidential library in Independence, which opened in 1957. He was intimately involved in its design and operation, creating a model for all his successors and ensuring historical access and the preservation of presidential papers for future generations. He also taught occasional university courses, including at Yale and Canisius College, sharing his deep interest in history and public service with students.
He was keenly aware of history's importance and his own place in it, and this personal commitment to the public record, to making presidential papers accessible, is a truly significant part of his lasting legacy, democratizing access to the past.
In his post-presidency, Truman remained politically active, continuing to campaign vigorously for Democratic candidates, especially John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. However, despite his groundbreaking civil rights actions as president, a complex and somewhat contradictory aspect of his legacy emerged. He expressed criticism of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, calling sit-ins a Soviet plot and the Selma March silly. He also privately voiced opposition to interracial marriage, a viewpoint that reflected the deeply ingrained societal prejudices of his upbringing and generation, even for someone who had taken courageous steps against segregation at the federal level.
This is indeed a complex and often uncomfortable aspect of his legacy. It reflects how deeply ingrained societal prejudices were, even for someone who took courageous, politically risky steps against segregation as president. It raises an important question about personal evolution versus consistent public stance, and the nuances of historical figures who, despite pioneering significant reforms, may not fully transcend all the biases of their time. It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, even within an individual.
In 1963, Truman penned a thought-provoking article for the Washington Post, warning that the CIA, which he had helped create, had been diverted from its original assignment of intelligence gathering and had become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. He urged a correction to its function, expressing prescient concerns about its unchecked power and potential for overreach, a warning that, in hindsight, proved remarkably perceptive. And in 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson honored Truman's earlier fight for government health care by choosing the Truman Library as the venue to sign the landmark Medicare bill, giving Harry and Bess the very first 2 Medicare cards. It was a poignant moment, connecting his visionary Fair Deal proposals for universal health insurance to a lasting and transformative piece of social legislation.
A truly full-circle moment, connecting his earliest progressive aims with a tangible, enduring legacy that continues to impact millions of Americans today.
Harry S. Truman passed away peacefully on December 26, 1972, at the age of 88, from multiple organ failure. Bess, always a private person, opted for a simple private service rather than a grand state funeral, in keeping with his own unassuming nature.
When he left office, Truman was, by many metrics, one of the most unpopular chief executives in history, with an approval rating lower than even Richard Nixon's at his resignation. However, over time, public and historical opinion warmed considerably, especially after his death during the tumultuous Vietnam and Watergate crises. He became a political folk hero, exemplifying an integrity, decisiveness, and accountability that many felt was desperately lacking at the time.
The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 led many to claim a profound vindication for his tough Cold War decisions, viewing his containment policy as ultimately successful in preventing a global nuclear conflict. Historians now consistently rank him among the top 10 or near-great presidents, with scholars like Robert Dallek highlighting his contribution to victory in the Cold War without a devastating nuclear conflict and his moral courage on civil rights. His legacy is certainly robust, honored with numerous institutions, buildings, and even a naval aircraft carrier, the USS Harry S. Truman, bearing his name. South Korea even erected a statue of him in 2023, commemorating his monumental decision to send U.S. troops to defend the country during the Korean War, a testament to his global impact. Truman's story truly underscores the idea that a president's legacy is never static. It evolves with time, new information, and the changing perspectives of new generations, often reflecting the nation's contemporary concerns and values. His improbable journey from an ordinary man facing personal and financial setbacks to a leader grappling with unprecedented world-altering challenges truly makes you wonder. Outro. So we've walked through the remarkable journey of Harry S. Truman, from a Missouri farmer and haberdasher who knew the sting of failure to a world leader who made some of the most consequential decisions in human history. He took on immense responsibilities, facing challenges that few could fathom, From authorizing the atomic bombs and navigating the dawn of global ideological conflicts to courageously fighting for civil rights in a deeply divided nation, all while managing domestic strife and relentless political attacks. What does his trajectory from relative obscurity to profoundly shaping the modern world tell us about the nature of leadership in times of profound crisis, especially when fate thrusts the burden upon the unprepared?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Truman's presidency serves as a powerful reminder that history is not just about grand strategies and geopolitical forces, but about the deeply human decisions made under extraordinary pressure, often with imperfect information and significant personal cost. His life illustrates the potential for growth, adaptation, and moral conviction in the face of immense obstacles, even for individuals who start with seemingly ordinary backgrounds, often revealing an inner fortitude that no resume could ever capture. It raises an important question. What seemingly ordinary person today might be on the cusp of shaping our future in ways we can't yet imagine? And what blend of resilience, pragmatism, and conviction will they need to navigate the complexities ahead?
That's a powerful thought to leave you with, and it certainly gives us much to consider. We encourage you to delve deeper into the specific policies and personal stories we've touched upon today. There's always more to learn about figures like Harry S. Truman, whose impact resonates to this very day. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.